The event is short, it's around 2 hours, not more than that, but we're gonna start with our opening with Mr. Nicolas Harrocks, Deputy Head of Mission from the British Embassy in Kyiv.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Доброго ранку. Good to see so many of you. I hope you managed to get an okay night's sleep last night, like all of us. Thank you for inviting me here today to talk about a really important topic for the UK, for our embassy, and also for me personally, a recovery agenda that leaves no one behind. The UK has a strong global reputation for standing up for the rights of women and girls around the world. In fact, it's a priority for the British Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, and has been a priority for several years. And it's also a pillar of the UK international development strategy. We're committed to ensuring that women's rights and gender and inclusion issues are integrated into the mainstream across our foreign, security, and defense policy, including in our work to support Ukraine. Our ambition's higher than ever. We want to make progress in 2023 to transform lives for the better, to help to build inclusive prosperity, stability, and a fairer and freer world for all. There's a new UK National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security, which is ambitious. Our foreign policy focuses on women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in political and peace processes, and more broadly in decision-making at the local, regional, and national levels. Ukraine's a focus country in our National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security, and we want to work closely with you here in the room and learn from your experience. The National Action Plan also involves holding ourselves to account. And for the first time, all UK government ministries have made commitments, new commitments, in a range of areas. So, for example, the UK Ministry of Defence has committed to increasing women's meaningful participation and leadership in UK defence, foreign and security policy. And it's going to conduct a gender barrier study to better understand the constraints on women's participation this far in peacekeeping missions. Our Ministry of Justice is committed to implementing a world-leading domestic approach to the prevention and response to violence against women and girls. It's publishing a draft law that will put victims and survivors, including women and girls, at the heart of the criminal justice system. And as a final example, the Home Office or Interior Ministry is investing £230 million or 285 million US dollars to respond to violence against women and girls through a new plan to tackle domestic abuse. If I return closer to home, our support to Ukraine's victory and recovery is at the heart of our foreign policy. It's my government's top foreign policy priority. And of course, it's essential to understand as we develop our policy and as we speak to international partners that women and girls, as well as marginalized groups, feel a different impact during wartime and have different needs for recovery after war. We also have to understand that women's and other groups' contributions to the war effort are key, and the role of women as leaders of the recovery to build back better in Ukraine at the national, regional, and local levels. The UK approach is shaped by these key considerations. For example, we see women and LGBT+ people serving in the military, delivering the humanitarian and emergency response, and leading within their communities to lay the foundation for inclusive recovery.
Sorry, everyone, we can go to -1 for shelter.
Do you want to go? Do you want to go? I don't mind. It's an important topic, so we'll keep trying. Okay, I can hear the translation. So, very good. So, I was saying, as we develop our policy, as we support Ukraine, we as the UK, but also the international community, it's really important that we focus as well on the fact that women and girls and marginalized groups feel a different impact during wartime and have different needs for recovery after war. We have to understand women's and other groups' contributions to the war effort and the role of women as leaders of the recovery to build back better in Ukraine at the national, regional, and local levels. And the UK approach is shaped by these key considerations. For example, we see women and LGBT plus people serving in the military, delivering the humanitarian emergency response, and leading within their communities to lay the foundations for inclusive recovery. The UK focuses on women and diverse groups as political actors in their own right, who are building the type of society they want to see once Russia's war of aggression has been defeated. A free, liberal, and inclusive Ukraine. As part of the UK's humanitarian emergency response assistance for Ukraine, we have worked to prioritize protection and inclusion of the people who've been most disproportionately affected by the war, as well as those who are hardest to reach. That includes women and girls, but also persons with disabilities, internally displaced people, and those suffering gender-based violence. We're focusing on the needs of people who've suffered conflict-related sexual, also on strengthening the justice system. As part of our humanitarian support, we also provide flexible funding to diverse local civil society organizations. This is to give critical assistance to internally displaced women, to enhance and support women's economic recovery and participation in humanitarian planning and response, and to protect women and girls from conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence. Early recovery is happening simultaneously alongside the war efforts and emergency response, of course, and planning for longer-term reconstruction is already underway. Like Ukraine, the UK is looking towards the future. Diverse voices must play a powerful part in creating this future. The UK is clear that now is the time to ensure recovery incorporates gender and inclusivity at its center, that different needs are understood and catered for, and that no one is left behind. Let me say something briefly about our support to civil society in Ukraine. This year, we'll support more than 24 civil society organizations with grants to pilot inclusive approaches to the recovery. That support will help civil society to deliver tailored services and to increase their advocacy, network building, and work on local governance. And as everyone here probably knows, the UK is hosting the Ukraine Recovery Conference in London next month. We've worked hard to ensure that civil society plays a meaningful role in the Ukraine Recovery Conference and that diverse voices are heard. We shall have a side event on gender responsive recovery, which is organized and sponsored by the British Embassy in Kyiv and others. And it'll be focused on the exact topic of my talk today and this conference, an approach to recovery that leaves no one behind. We're determined to use the conference to prompt a bigger and broader discussion about inclusion in Ukraine's recovery. And to close, finally, you'll say, self-evidently, feminism isn't just a woman's issue. It concerns everyone in society, obviously men included. Men should champion feminism because supporting women and inclusion supports everyone in society. It builds the strongest possible societies founded on the values of human rights, freedom, and diversity. And I can promise you the UK will continue to support women and inclusion in Ukraine until the victory and afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm Henar. I'm working as Senior Policy Advisor for the Ukraine Response for ActionAid. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the people online. And thank you in particular to the speakers and more in particular for partners. It has been an honor working with you. I would talk briefly about the report, standing up for rights, feminist insights from the Ukraine response that we have done together with those 28 partners. I'm going to change a little bit and be more shorter than I was planning. I would like to say only about the objectives of the report that were showcasing positive actions with an intersectional perspective and when possible lessons learned. And I mean positive actions by partners, of course, and elaborate a set of practical recommendations for ActionAid, ourselves, donors, international NGOs, partners, organizations to develop comprehensive response operations led by women and young people in crisis contexts, but also with a triple nexus perspective, considering also the mid-term and the long-term and those post-conflict and recovery. The methodology that we use were mainly through three workshops that were inspired by our women-led community-based protection approach and focus in three main areas, which is violence and discrimination faced by women before and after Ukraine's invasion by Russia. Second, the programmatic response of the organizations in front of this violence. And third, the gaps and the recommendations to solve these gaps that the organizations identified. And also in-depth interviews and a survey on women and young people leadership. In terms of the key findings, we can see that the response to Russia's military assault to Ukraine is yet, unfortunately, another example on how the international system, and us included, is still failing to acknowledge and promote the work of civil society organizations like women's rights organizations, women-led organizations, and young people groups. Those groups play critical roles in crisis responses and recovery, but still lack political and financial support and recognition. We are talking about a critical role in terms of the response to discrimination and gender-based violence increased since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 22, and how this violence intersects with the discrimination experienced in light of the ethnic background, gender, sexual orientation, age, disability, and other social constraints. Partner work has been and is critical in addressing those issues. And we are talking, for example, about self-organized excluded groups, which were already fighting discrimination before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and how they have done a key and essential role to protect the rights of already previously marginalized people, often largely forgot by other stakeholders. But at the same time, this has brought more responsibility, stress, and workload on their shoulders. And in terms of lack of adequate support, many women and their organizations face harassment, persecution, and other threats. And beyond some formal process, women's rights are not really being prioritized in the agendas under the understanding that now is not the time to address those issues with a clear lack of policy coherence. Those organizations are not receiving adequate funding. 65% of the respondents to our survey have stressed that donors did not fund their core mission and activities. Instead, funding was sent to activities pertaining to immediate emergency responses. And sometimes what was being accepted in this framework was very limited. And also, despite the international commitment to grand bargain, funding is not being directly sent to local and national actors. We can see that in the Ukraine response, less than 50% of the funding is not going to UN agencies or international NGOs. Also, national organizations are struggling to maintain the long-term mandate of advocating against discrimination in different policy processes, including racism and gender inequality. And despite some exceptions and efforts that I think we are going to see later with the roundtable, women's rights and women-led and young people do not feel that they have a place in government-led or internationally led decision-making spaces. Finally, in terms of the recommendations, at least some of them, you can see, of course, the full report, online in English and Ukrainian. Sorry, I forgot to say this. But we have seen, or we believe, and our partners believe, that women and their organizations have to be in the center of the humanitarian action and recovery. Because when it's the case, we have more effective, inclusive, and efficient humanitarian response standing in place to support the whole community. And also because an inclusive and sustainable society is not possible without gender equality. Humanitarian actors need to strengthen the linkages of emergency response and recovery with women's rights. They have to integrate an intersectional gender perspective in all humanitarian response and recovery, and social protection measures to address the intersectional needs of the communities. We have also to include anti-discrimination approaches, including anti-racism, and consultation processes with meaningful participation of marginalized and excluded groups, and support the political participation and leadership of those groups. And we also need qualitative, structural, and flexible funding opportunities for women's rights organizations and women-led organizations. And finally, we are talking about inclusivity, which is not about opening the door, but creating a humanitarian and donor system that is inclusive and that proactively takes steps forward to have national voices at the table, and also that dedicates human and economic resources to respond to their demands and agendas. So thank you very much. And with that, I will give the floor to our roundtable, first introducing Daria Chekalova, who is the Deputy Director of NGO Girls, and she has worked in the sphere of women's rights and women, girls, and children's rights for 4 years. Her previous experience includes managing awareness-raising campaigns and supporting projects improving children's digital literacy and preventing sexual abuse online. At the NGO, Daria is project manager and deputy to the director. She leads several humanitarian response projects and is responsible for grant writing and manages business development and partnership communication. Welcome, Daria.
So thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm so happy to see all the familiar faces in the room, but also to see faces that I haven't seen before. I'm so glad that we've overcome, all the challenges, particularly today, and we're gathered here. And I will be joined by three magnificent women leaders and feminist leaders in Ukraine. So I'm going to introduce them, and then we'll start a discussion. So we're going to be who is a director of strategic development, in the Ukrainian Women's Fund, Analee, who is the senior gender advisor to the UN resident coordinator. And then are we going to be joined online? Will that work with Henar? Yeah. Online, we are going to be joined by Henar, who is a co-director on policy, advocacy, and programs in ActionAid UK. And I'm so thrilled to be able to speak with all three of them. We'll start with Natalia. So I'm sure all of you know perfectly well that Ukrainian Women's Fund is one of the biggest and most prominent feminist, women-led and women's rights organization in Ukraine. So Natalia, you probably know so much about everything that's on agenda for us today. And I was going to ask you to speak about that a little bit more in terms of what the fund is doing, but also particularly in the field of us transition from the emergency response to recovery and how this is affecting your work.
Thank you. Доброго дня, шановні учасниці. Thank you very much. I was in the program. This part of the event is called round table, and I think it's really a round table, even in terms of the format and everything. And I was thinking today that this is, our experience today is actually the way how women's organizations in different parts of the country work now. Despite all the challenges, despite the missiles and everything, we are working, we are thinking about the future, we are providing emergency support, and not only emergency support, long-term support to our stakeholders, to our target audience, because this is the only way to live now and keep going. Indeed, Ukrainian Women's Fund has been working for almost 23 years in Ukraine on strengthening the movement. Some of us call it feminist movement, some of us call it women's movement, but this is our movement. These are women's organizations, feminist organizations, and also activists who are working tirelessly in different parts of Ukraine with different target audiences, with women with disability, and very glad that national governments, our partners, here with many other with many other Może ja szybko
You may be too far from the.
Okay.
So we could go on, but then everybody could decide.
Can you hear me now? Oh, super. Okay, why did I stop? So, in terms of what we see from there in our work with women's and feminist organizations now is that, we all are organizations are trying to work on trying to address so many different issues at the same time. And although there is a challenge with this that we see and we kind of keep talking about with the donors, that women's organizations, feminist organizations, especially those at the grassroots level, with different humanitarian organizations to deliver humanitarian aid to their target audience. But this work requires a lot of resources and a lot of time and stuff. And often the organizations have to make difficult choices in this regard, in terms of either because of the limited staff capacity and limited financial resources. They have to decide, they are making these decisions whether to continue working on humanitarian aid or work on policies, on advocacy. And we as the movement see that there is a danger with this, because this might lead to the situation where we might lose the gains that we achieved in terms of women's rights and gender equality in the country, because there is basically in some regions there is nobody to advocate now, because everybody is busy with humanitarian aid. So this is something that we see as a challenge, and we think it should be addressed, both from the organization's perspectives and also from problem. Yeah. Давайте я себе буду перекладати. Maybe I should just say in English and then translate myself.
Everybody who's online, всі, хто онлайн включені, вони нічого не будуть чути, бачити. Should we wait, or should we maybe kind of interrupt ourselves?
Maybe we can do consecutive. I mean, we can hear also online because we have the microphone.
Should we invite? Yeah, can people online still hear us? Yeah, so we can interpret. That's the question. People online. So yeah.
We all just need to learn Ukraine.
So I know. And Lucas said
Організатор вимкнув мікрофон у перекладача.
So there's the organizer has
Turned off.
has turned off the mic for interpreter.
Why? No.
It's translate microphone.
Yeah.
Natasha, it's so good to have you with us. You're like, the messenger from the online world.
Technical work.
They restart game.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
It's on now.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, so I'll be, the interpreters can hear me now, right? Yeah. Oh, super. So I will be then super fast. What I was going to say is that we as the movement still, of course, despite the fact that we are very busy and everything, we are thinking about the future. And what we developed is their roadmap of the women's movement. So this is the document which is the result of a number of consultations with big number of NGOs, including those women's NGOs, including those that are present here. And this is the strategy and our vision, first of all, and also the strategy on how we see ourselves, the movement, being vocal, being influential, and being helpful for the country at the end of the day and for our target audiences in the nearest time. The document includes recommendations both for the movement, for the government at the level. It also includes recommendations for international community, for donors, and our vision on how their international technical assistance, different types of international assistance should work for the benefits of Ukrainian women. Their roadmap also includes something that we are very proud of. This is their the charter of our joint feminist values. And those of us who are involved in the movement in Ukraine and also in other countries, I'm sure you will agree that, developing a document, in general, discussing the joint values is always a big challenge. But we managed to do this, and despite we agreed basically on a set of joint principles that make us Ukrainian feminists and women's rights activists, and we think that these principles should be for our joint work and also for our work on recovery. So I have the flyers with me. Sorry, they're in Ukrainian. We don't have English yet, but their roadmap is available in English as well. It's on our website. So I will probably, I don't know, shall I pass them through the? Thank you. Okay, this one. Yeah, so in terms of recovery, there are several recommendations, and sorry for jumping from one thing to another.
That's what I was going to ask you. Maybe you think that transition to recovery is going to solve any of the challenges that you mentioned?
Well, of course, there is there is no one. Everything is not black and white, right? But we think that definitely transition to recovery is one of the ways, one of the steps forward. And for this, there are several things several recommendations that we discussed as the movement. First of all, we need to work with the government and with international community on developing clear methodology of the recovery strategy and recovery plan. Now, the document that is recovery strategy, how the priorities who decides on this? What are the criteria? Whether we vote or support possibly, let's say, what are the targets? What are the benchmarks that organizations are discussing now? And we hope there will be a way to bring this information to London and also post URC activities, because obviously London is extremely important, but also, you know, there are what happens after London is of equal importance. We also need to develop our own capacities as women's and feminist organizations. In terms of policies analysis, in terms of producing recommendations for the governments, because, you know, we have to learn these systems, how this work, and what are the most effective ways to influence on the policies. And for this, we need capacity building support from international organizations. We also need to be at the tables where these decisions are made. At the moment in Ukraine, we are lacking these platforms, unfortunately. Well, London conference is a good, and I participated in the previous two. I was in Toronto and also in Lugano last year, and I can, you know, from my experience, London is a huge step forward in terms of inclusion of civil society organizations. But still, I think we are not, you know, the platforms for these are mostly based on donors' interventions. We need governments to be more proactive in this. We need platforms to deliver our ideas to the government. And these platforms, these tables should be convenient to sit at, not only to those who are making decisions, but also to us. And I think, yeah, I'll probably stop on this. If there are any questions or comments, I'd be glad to.
I think we will have questions and comments to all three participants afterwards. So there will be time to ask. So just keep in mind whatever you might want to ask Natalia. And keep in mind that was so insightful, actually, and so right. I couldn't agree more with every word that Natalia was saying. And I'm going to probably address some of the things you mentioned to Analee here, because, and I promised you, not so easy questions, because Natalia mentioned so many things that international community in general and the UN system in particular, which you represent, can be an active part and even take a lead in. So I was going to ask you if there is any planning on doing so, any plans on making these platforms and these, ways for more open and more accessible towards different organizations.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for me, and thank you for the incredibly tough questions. And it's incredibly unfair that I have to call on Natalia. But my role within the UN is that I support the entire system for humanitarian actors, whether they're international NGOs, national NGOs, or UN agencies or volunteer-based organizations. And I think it's important to say that because I sit with the humanitarian coordinator, but I'm just as much a resource to DevChata or Fund as I am to UNICEF or WHO, right? And when I first arrived in Ukraine, actually, I think it was Natalia who told me this, who said, if you're going to do humanitarian assistance here and you're going to go to women's organizations and ask them to work with you, you have to understand exactly the same anxiety that Natalia has mentioned now. We don't want to lose the momentum of everything that we've been doing already. And the women's movement in Ukraine was incredibly strong when the humanitarian system scaled up here. And it's a bit of it's good and bad in certain ways. The attention did get directed more towards humanitarian, which had implications that were not positive always. But at the same time, the humanitarian response in Ukraine has benefited exponentially from the women-led organizations and women's rights organizations in this country. I was able to see immediately when I arrived here, and we've gotten a bit better, but when I arrived, it was very clear that the women's organizations were much stronger than the international actors coming in on gender equality and humanitarian assistance at that time. And so I really focused on working with actors like DevChata, like Ukrainian Women's Fund, like others who were very much leading what was happening at the front lines. But what that means is, everything's okay with the translation. What that means is we had to adjust our coordination systems because otherwise there was no way that national partners were going to waste their time coming and talking to me and being part of these coordination spaces that they didn't see as valuable, right? And so we've done a lot to change our systems. What I see as one of the biggest challenges is that we are not great at communicating what we've changed. So I talk to Daria about this often. A good example is the Ukrainian Humanitarian Fund, which I think some of those of you in the room have engaged with. The Ukrainian Humanitarian Fund in April of last year, I think was giving maybe 0.01% or something to women's organizations in Ukraine in terms of how much funding was getting to women-led actors. That's changed. We've made a huge effort to make sure that national organizations have access to funding, but also have access to decision-making over who gets funding, right? Daria sat on what has never been done before, but we have a gender review committee for national pooled funds now. That doesn't exist in any other country. And we have national women-led organizations influencing that process. Have we told anyone that we're doing that though? No, right? So there's also this conversation of what can we do to make our systems better, but also how can we then tell actors who would benefit what we're doing, which also would open the door to national actors telling us, nice try, but you didn't do enough, right? We would like you to do more. And that's a conversation that I'm trying to push with the national women's organizations, organizations of people with disability, Roma activist groups, these groups who, as my colleague said, they'll be left behind if we don't include them in this conversation. And I'm so happy to see that this work that's been done on humanitarian response is now moving into the early recovery conversations. We were just speaking before this event started on how I saw women's CSOs making this very, I'm sure, challenging internally, but from outside seemed to be very natural transition into humanitarian response from a women's rights agenda. And that was, early mid last year. They already had capacity, they already had strength. these were not the same groups that the rest of the humanitarian system was working with to build up their capacity, train them on how to do distributions, train them on how to work with communities. And so for me, I had the benefit of having national partners who were already very strong. Of course, there's going to be challenges transitioning out of humanitarian or increasingly less on humanitarian into early recovery. But, and of course, my partners here can tell me if I'm wrong. I think the challenge is not for the women CSOs. I think the challenge is for those of us around to see how do we facilitate you doing that. You know what needs to be done on early recovery. You know exactly what your recommendations are, as you said. How you already have it organized. I think for the UN, it's us looking to partners and saying, what do you need from us? And how do we work together? So not just one-sided, the UN is not going to fix everything. I think we all know that, but more, what do you need from us? How do we work with you to make it a more productive relationship? And on that note, one of the things that we've been doing with my office, the resident coordinator's office, and with UN Women, thanks Rihanna's in the room, doing these roundtable consultations with women CSOs. I know some of the actors in the room have participated in these already, in there, of course. And these are an opportunity not to talk about whatever we want, but for women CSOs to influence the very highest levels of UN senior management, right? To come to meet with the directors and say, these are our 5 priorities, and we want you to do something about it today, right? Make your commitments. That is, at least in my experience, working in many different countries on humanitarian response, I haven't seen that happen a lot. So I think there are these big wins in terms of having actual conversations, creating space at the highest levels of decision-making for women-led organizations and feminist organizations. We definitely need to do more. The humanitarian coordinator and myself did a roundtable tour last month, and we met with women's organizations that are providing just the most critical assistance to the front line. Tell us, you know, the UN is not doing enough, and you know, we're not happy with the assistance and this and that. They said, have people come and work with us without having to worry about, you know, a missile attack. We just need you to advocate for us at the local authority level. Really concrete things. We can fix that. Within 2 days, we had been able to have conversations. Then how are we expecting anything to be done, right? I don't want to go on too long, but I do just want to say it's been incredibly easy for me to do my job because of the national partners. And the early recovery work is moving along well, and I do think it's great to hear, you know, member states, like the UK. It's great to hear from leaders like Natalia saying we're seeing this as, you know, an opportunity for more inclusive early recovery and reconstruction. But everything's moving very, very fast, right? So we kind of need to make sure we get the right voices in, at the table. And I hope that the UN, and whether it's me or it's my colleagues, the resident coordinator, I hope that we can coordinate in a way that's reasonable. Please bear with us if any of you have emailed someone and they haven't responded or you haven't gotten the answer that you want. But I do think we're trying hard to make sure the right voices are at the table. And sometimes it seems time consuming to come to our meetings, but tell us that, right? We're receptive to it, and we'll fix the way that we coordinate to adjust so that when we have a meeting about early recovery, I can call Div Chapta and say, what are your insights about this? What are the points you want me to raise, right? Maybe I'll just end on that for now, because I know you'll come back to me. But I have so much respect for the women CSOs. Good timing.
Should we move back or should we continue here? Should we go back or should we?
Yeah, we just
but I'm not sure about.
Stay, maybe there will be another reserve.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. So I think I might be, talking everybody here and everybody's listening us online, that it is extremely valuable for you to acknowledge, the agency and the experience that has been already there and stays here, that you and the broader UN system was able to work with. And I would actually, with the permission of the hosts, I would really like to go really practical about, what are the meetings you were talking about? What are, give us the names, give us the links, for everybody who's listening now to know exactly who they can email about, about participation in this. I try to, to dedicate as much time as I have, and I try to participate in so many things that you are either a part of or a lead of. And I know that most of them are extremely practical and valuable. And we have, like my NGO, for example, and I know that many of the NGOs present here as well, they've taken so much, maybe not always in a ways that were planned, but sometimes in the most extraordinary and surprising ways. But we've taken so much from that. So I would really like to go very practical with. We have her here to say what are the exact ways we can do that.
Definitely. I don't have a full answer to it, but I can give some examples, maybe. When I first arrived in Ukraine, the former director of UN Women, Erica, I'm sure many of those of you in the room have worked with her, was just an outstanding leader for UN Women. And she introduced me to some women CSO leaders in Spain. And they told me, we do not have time to be coming to your meetings, but we want to be informed, right? We want the information that you have. We want to know about funding opportunities, partnership opportunities, and coordination. And so we agreed that this Gender and Humanitarian Assistance Working Group that now exists, which we're part of, that it would not be set up like the cluster system. It would be set up in a way that was specifically tailored to the needs and context of local actors. Every month, if you want to come for a certain presentation, we advertise the topics in advance, so you don't have to waste your time if it's not of interest. We spend most of the time focused on what national organizations are doing in the country, and we've tried to have a diversity. So we've had organizations like Fight for Right present on, it's a women-led organization of people with disabilities that provides very critical humanitarian assistance, right? We've had Sphere in Kyiv that works with LGBTQI populations and provides cash distributions. I believe they're an ActionAid partner, if I'm not mistaken. So we've had these great organizations be able to present their work to an international community, and then that has led to partnerships, right? So you were telling me this morning that Devchata is now getting training from the Bureau for Gender Strategy and Budgeting in Poltava, one of the most outstanding organizations that I've met in Ukraine that's receiving funding, one of the first women's organizations and feminist organizations in Ukraine to receive that funding, and is using it to provide gender and humanitarian assistance training to frontline workers, and now has expanded to be providing training to organizations like Devchata. We wanted to create a group that would serve the needs of the national partners before it served the needs of the UN and international NGOs, because we knew that actors, ActionAid is a perfect example, would be happy with that model, right? I know I worked with Trina, and we had so many discussions of how can we help international NGOs find the national partners that they need. It's not going to be through some very cumbersome mapping exercise. It's going to be through these coordination spaces. So I think that's a good one. I think another one, and this is very concrete, but when I first met with a Voice of Romni, the Roma Women's CSO, one of the things that they were doing was that they were supporting the World Food Program to distribute food kits to Roma communities that otherwise would not have had the right information to get access to those services. And the World Food Program recognized, we don't have these networks. Let's get a national organization that has those contacts to help us with the distribution. Such an easy fix, right? We should be doing more of that, and we should take those lessons from humanitarian response and move them to our early recovery response, right? We're going to start working on durable solutions, which, if you don't know that obnoxious term and what it means, it's a little bit cumbersome sometimes, but basically it's how to develop sustainable solutions for displaced populations, right? We're going to be working with actors like, Women's Perspectives in Lviv, who just have some of the best centers for displaced women that I've seen in this country. We want to take those actors and build on their experiences, right? So I'll leave a bunch of cards here. I'm happy to share my contact. I want everyone to contact me. Usually it's me chasing after you guys. But I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. And moving to Hannah, are we going to have her online? So will we be able to see her on your screen?
Yes,
Okay.
maybe I can. Yes.
So Hannah, unfortunately, I cannot see you. I hope you're there with us. And we've been talking so much about the London conference and about what's it going to be like for the Ukrainian civil society, this transition to recovery, rebuilding, and development, building on more durable solutions, as Analee mentioned. So I know that you're probably the best person to ask about that. And I wanted to ask what are the challenges of the London conference, but also, as Natalia mentioned, what may be the challenges of what follows the London conference in terms specifically of gender equality. And I know we've talked a little bit about us preparing for that and us seeing a lot of effort and a lot of improvement from last year, from Uganda, for example. But we all know that still it can be more inclusive. It can be more capacitated in terms of civil society. And I was really interested in hearing what you think about that.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we
Great.
can. Loud and clear.
Thank you. That's really good news. The connection has dipped in and out a little bit, so I'm sorry if I end up repeating things that other colleagues have said. But as you all know, I'm Hannah Bond, co-director of policy advocacy and programs at ActionAid UK, and I know, not least because you've had to relocate during the session, that it's been a really difficult night and difficult day. So you have my love and my thoughts and solidarity.
Hannah,
please.
So sorry to interrupt you, but we've lost the translation. Give us just a moment to
Of course.
Yeah, we'll come back. So sorry, but as you can see, we're here. Yeah, we're here in the basement, so bear with us.
Yes, that's okay. Just tell me when to start speaking.
It's good now.
It's good now. You can go on.
Yeah.
Very mute.
No problem. From my side. I was just saying that I know it's been, not least because you've had to relocate downstairs, it's been a really difficult day and night before, so you have my love and my thoughts and my solidarity. And I'm really sorry not to be there in person with all of you, ActionAid partners, other members of the feminist movement, the UK Embassy and UN Women. As you all know, the focus of the UK conference, and our colleague from the UK Embassy has already said this, really focuses on reconstruction. And I think one of the challenges that we've seen is that there's a broad conception that reconstruction is about bridges and roads, and that for some reason people think that bridges and roads aren't gendered and don't have a gender perspective. But of course, we know that even bridges and roads do. Where they go from, where they go to, why one road is prioritized as a priority over another road, and how those roads are lit are, of course, all gendered. But we know, of course, that particularly after bombardment, reconstruction is particularly gendered when we think of things like public services, hospitals, whether there are maternity units in hospitals, ensuring that when schools are rebuilt, that they are safe spaces for girls, that transport systems are safe, that they're well lit, that they're accessible, particularly for people living with disabilities, that GBV services are prioritised. We know that GBV increases during conflict, but of course also psychosocial support, that when we think of reconstruction and we think of recovery, we know as people who are either parts of the feminist movement, as many of you are, or parts of international organisations, that that's also really gendered, and particularly the patriarchal norms that come around conflict. And it's really important that reconstruction and recovery considers that. But one of the challenges that we see, as I was saying, is that it's really deeply misunderstood, and that when people hear reconstruction, they think essentially exclusively about roads and bridges. And as I've just said, we all know that it's a lot bigger than that. I think both one of the opportunities and the challenges is your role as national civil society and our role as international civil society in essentially doing what you do in providing services, advocating for gendered responses, but also holding your government, holding donors, you know, like the UK, like UN Women, and also the private sector to account. And that's going to be hugely important with this upcoming Ukraine Reconstruction Conference, because one of the aims, as I understand it, is that there will be deals between private sector organisation, governments, both Ukraine and globally, and donors. And we know often that when you get into those private sector spaces, that a lot of this stuff becomes less public. But also when you involve international financial institutions who often push austerity measures where they want to reduce public services in return for the, in quotes, investment that they provide. But you all know that often what that means is cuts to public services. But as we've all said, public services need to be gendered and they need to increase after conflict, not, of course, decrease. So I think one of the really important things is your role and our role in holding the private sector and donors and governments to account for what those deals are, and A, whether they are gendered, and B, do they actually provide the things that you all want and need? It's great that our colleague is here from the UK Embassy, and would be really, you know, it's great to hear about the side events and things. But so far we haven't seen an agenda because they're closed and happen between the government parties. And that makes it kind of difficult to see where the gender perspective is. But let me just say the sorts of things that we have been pushing for, and we've been pushing for those things based on the things that ActionAid partners have told us. But also, of course, you know, the UK has hosted similar conferences like this with other countries in the past. So we, for example, called for, as you've had in previous Ukraine conferences, a civil society day the day before. Unfortunately, with this conference, it won't be a civil society only day. It's a multi-sector day at Chatham House, a think tank. So we kind of miss out on some of the really important discussions that civil society have. As with other conferences that the UK has hosted, we've also pushed for civil society who are in that civil society day to have a slot at the main conference to feed back on that. The civil society day isn't happening, so that won't happen, but we don't know yet if the Chatham House event will be summarised and brought into the main conference. As you've heard from our colleague from the UK Embassy, there will be a sort of women, peace and security, a gender and reconstruction side event, which is great. But we've really asked if that sort of a session could be built into the agenda where representatives from Ukrainian feminist and women's rights organizations could come and speak at that. Most importantly, because you then get access to the main conference and they get to hear directly from you rather than sort of being in a separate event. Previously, for example, in 2014, when the UK hosted an Afghanistan conference, we managed to be successful in having a women's rights or a gender breakfast in the morning, where civil society, in this case from Ukraine, would come together with key decision makers, government ministers, for example, to have that direct access in the morning that can sort of set the tone for the event, particularly because we know that when the events start, lots of the sort of main business in inverted commas can take over at the expense of the gender discussion. At the moment, that's not happening, but it's something that we would absolutely love to see, and we would love to see, you know, many of you there. Of course, we've called for extensive participation of civil society and women's rights organisations. I know that I think one one of you in the room has been invited, but hopefully many more of you. And yeah, I guess just sort of to close, you know, there are lots of ways in which these sorts of conferences can feature gender equality. And I think particularly because of the nature of this being on reconstruction and how patriarchal lots of those discussions can be, there's a massive opportunity for both the UK and the Ukrainian governments to really meet the commitments that have been made in national action plans on women, peace and security, and for example the more recent Swiss conference. But it really is an honor to speak to you all today. I'm sorry that it's from a distance, but you all are teaching us a huge amount from your feminist movement, and I'm certainly very grateful to have your time today. And I hope from what I've said, you can see that we've really been pushing internationally to support the work that you've been doing. And I hope that there's an opportunity to see some of you in London in a couple of weeks.
Thank you so much. Thank you for presenting, but also thank you for the incredible warm important to understand that we are met, you know, after doing our part of the job here in Ukraine. We will be met from with you and fellow experts there from the UK. I think I was told that there are some questions in the chat already, and also we can open the floor for the questions from here. So I would ask someone to read what's in the chat.
In the chat, there is a question for Natalia about if there is online the roadmap she has been shown before, if there is an online version.
Natalia?
Yes, well, thank you for the question. Indeed, there is an online version on the Ukrainian Women's Fund's website. There are two versions actually, in Ukrainian and in English. I'm sorry, I cannot give the link.
No worry, I can.
Yeah. Can you just, yeah, the uwf.org, I think.
Is there anything else from there, from the chat? No. So we can open the floor for questions from here. Of course, звісно. Але я, мабуть, вас запрошу підійти до я не знаю, наскільки добре ви.
To put a question, you have to approach the mic, and I'm afraid, because we are working in these ad hoc conditions and have experience in terrible technical difficulties. Yeah. Living through this. We can. First of all, I would like to thank the Ukrainian Women's Fund. So we've been partners for a long time. We've been partners. And UN Women, we are also non-standing partners with them, and would like to thank your organization for our cooperation. The issues you discussed are very challenging. It is not enough to have one event dedicated to them. This event in particular, we would like to discuss more humanitarian aid concerning our group, because I represent here women and men with disabilities, parents who educate children, bring up children with disabilities. This is our focus, this is our core business. We need systemic changes, and we think that some humanitarian standards should be adjusted. And we can tell you that from experience, from the Ukrainian experience. We are not happy with the humanitarian plan that they have in Ukraine, because it divides women women and men with disability, and we have to stay united. Let me explain. According to the UN data and our data, for that matter, the majority of people with disability are beyond the subsistence level, subsistence line, less than $50 per month. This is not enough. This is very small for the war conditions. In the humanitarian plan, we have the prioritized frontline areas that which are continuously under fire and bombardments, and many disabled women who live in Poltava, Cherkasy, Vinnytsia, Volyn regions are not included in the humanitarian plans because they are not considered to be under such conditions, and there is no assistance provided to those regions of Ukraine. We approach the clusters, sometimes they responded, sometimes they don't. We can wait for more than a month for any response to our letters. We think that this is unacceptable for Ukraine because we are a national organization and we are monitoring very closely all the flows of information. And this assistance needed in the sad regions. And we know that women and men with disability need this assistance. So the humanitarian plan actually left without any assistance a big group of women who are not living in the prioritized regions, so to speak. Quote unquote. And speaking of gender issues, gender-related issues, our position for the disabled people is related. Well, actually, we connect disability and gender issues because there are Roma with disabilities, LGBT with disabilities, or women who have children with disabilities, or IDPs with disabilities. This is a great concern for us, you know, because we also are very much concerned that the London conference and other conferences that have taken place already do not present any kind of unity or togetherness on our part. We know that the plans and recommendations are prepared by the big humanitarian aid players present in Ukraine, different organizations, and we would like to have unity. Unity thus expressed. We do not want to have champions here. Gender issues, disability issues should be interrelated and properly taken into account. And we have seen in the steps which have now been made in Ukraine presently, and this is also true for recovery. The disability issue is sort of disregarded. We are recovering hospitals, kindergartens, schools, and they are still inaccessible for such people. We are talking about leadership and support of civil society organizations, but there is no institutional support for organizations like us. We are working with many stakeholders with the food stuffs program, and we are happy that they changed their food parcels responding our requests, and they changed other things, but the cash program among other things, but there are barriers that we can remove or totally liquidate. And I suggest that we have a longer day. I understand that we're all nervous because of the air defense alerts, but these issues deserve a deeper and wider discussion.
Summarize has the translation what was said, and it was all about people with disabilities and women with disabilities, and how they are so often left behind and pushed aside from the existing agendas. And there were some concrete examples stated. Like, for example, there is a humanitarian plan which divides women and men with disabilities. And also there is much priority given to some regions, mostly regions who are close to front lines, but some other regions are not represented enough in the plan. And it leads to the situation with people with disabilities who are living in these regions who are not prioritized by the plans and recommendations that exist. It pushes them out of the support programs. It pushes them out of the attention, which is unacceptable, because most of them, according to the UN data as well, live in poverty for around like 50 equivalent of $50 a month, which is unacceptable. So this was the first question brought up about the humanitarian plan and the focus on some very specific regions, which is not really inclusive. Then there was mentioned that the cluster system is not always effective as well, because sometimes they would step up and take the recommendations and work on them, and sometimes they would not, and it's unclear what that depends on really, and how to change the situation. And then, so one of the overall recommendations would be to more closely interlink the questions and the issues of gender sensitive with the issues of disability and inclusion, because sometimes they're still being divided, and the latter receive less support and attention. And then another topic was about that the conferences, London conference being a part of that, but also overall the structure of support and coordination that's going on does not suggest unity, which I think was already brought up here, that there is no unity and there is no overall unite understanding, because bigger humanitarian players are developing their recommendations, they're presenting them, but so many of small organizations and what they are doing and their findings, their data and their recommendations are not being taken into consideration. So the recommendation would be here to give more space to kind of coordinating and uniting that, to include these inputs from small organizations and from organizations with different perspectives and different focuses into the broader agenda, into the broader recommendations of, for example, the UN organizations or cluster recommendations and everything. And what we see now, and what will be, I'm speaking for myself here, personally, I hopefully would be addressed in the London conference, is that from what we see now, because reconstruction and recovery has already started, we want that or not, but the roads and bridges that Hannah mentioned are already being reconstructed and the hospitals are being rebuilt. And what we see now is that they are not built back better. They are built back as they were, without, for example, a concrete example was mentioned, without, better focus on inclusivity, or without inclusive equipment that we really need. So they're just being built back as they were. And the organization, jak prawильно называется организация? So the National Assembly of People with Disability, it works with many UN organizations, World Food Program being one of them, and they have, the World Food Program, they have changed the food kits on the basis of recommendations given, particularly from this organization. But still we have, so this is an example of good cooperation, which resulted in real, implementing of better approach. But there are still so many barriers that we need to address that probably will need a much lengthier event. And I'm speaking probably, I'm talking to the ActionAid hosts here. If you're open, to discuss that, we will need a much longer conference on that, and much longer discussion. That would be really interesting. Thank you so much.
Can I respond?
Of course.
thank you so much, Larissa, for bringing these issues up. I'm a huge fan of the work that you do, as you know. One of the things that I think, especially for the conversation we're having today at this event, the Humanitarian Response Plan only looked at certain regions because those regions were prioritized for humanitarian assistance, with the understanding that durable solutions and early recovery and reconstruction would be the space that we can start to now provide more assistance for those areas. But as with everything, everyone's doing 500 things every day, and these thought processes will be forgotten if you don't keep bringing them up. So I want to say thank you for keeping that on the table. We prioritized frontline areas for life-saving humanitarian response, but a lot of the poverty alleviation is closely tied to humanitarian assistance. We know that we met with people in Kramatorsk who are saying, there's no possible way I'm going to go to Dnipro are not accessible for someone with limited mobility. And you don't have the financial resources in Vinnytsia to ensure that the collective centers have male and female separate bathrooms, right? So those are issues that they weren't in the priorities for the Humanitarian Response Plan possibly, but they will be going forward. And on the topic of having another meeting, which I think we absolutely should, I think there should be hundreds of these. We had a roundtable with organizations of people with disabilities, at which I believe you were one of the co-chairs, the National Association for People with Disability, with League of the Strong and others. And that was a moment for the UN to say, what do you want from us? And how can we better partner with you? We'll have another meeting specifically on early recovery and how we can make sure that that's inclusive for people with different kinds of disabilities, as well as with veterans organizations. And I very much encourage any of those of you in the room who are interested in it. I believe National Association has already been invited and some others. We would love to find ways to support those conversations. So if there are those of you in the room who have those kinds of discussions, because of comments like what has been said about including gender, disability inclusion, minority groups, etc., we're trying to bring that lens to everything we do. So if you want to have a conversation on that, we are excited to do that, and we'll ensure that that is being brought to the attention of, you know, the Office of the Prime Minister and the Resident Humanitarian Coordinator for the UN, and these very high-level spaces where they want to hear from you, right? We just need to create the spaces to do that. So thank you so much for bringing that up.
Thank you, Analee. And if we have like half a minute more, I was going to give floor to Natalia once again.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to reflect on what Larissa said. Indeed, we need to, different platforms, different networks to address these issues, and I'm really thankful to ActionAid for organizing today's conversation, for having this platform. I also think it's important for us to to talk not within our bubble, but also with the other civil society movements, right? And there will be a conference tomorrow, and I hope many of those who are present here will participate, because this will be an important platform for us to talk about women and men with disabilities, about women, about different diverse groups of women. At the bigger event, bigger platform, the organizers are saying that there will be around 1,000 participants or so, and this is a conference to prepare to London. So I hope to see many of you tomorrow there, and to see that we are a loud voice of women's and feminist organizations there, and to be continued. So thank you. Tam gdzie można zarejestrować, zaraz pokażę.
It is necessary to register to participate in the conference. It will be held in the Arts Arsenal. This is the conference or exhibition hall tomorrow. Feel free to come there. They will welcome you there.
You probably know too about that's the Sarjevanya.
Sarjevanya.
Yeah, we'll have it.
Yeah, because then we can circulate it to more of the other groups as well.
So are we going? I think, yeah, we're going to close this session and I will pass the mic to you again.
Thank you, for your questions all the time and for the insightful conversations. I agree, we need more. So let's do it. And, yeah, have a nice day.
Thank you.